of you, if not all, were in our last session, or the 2 sessions back when Paige and I chatted about sort of a basic intro to assessment, and then Paige and Brian ran a session on reporting, how to navigate, and sort of what data we can get out of there and what access you have. Again, we've got multitudes of access to data, so if you're ever curious for anything out of Data Warehouse or any other sources that you might not have access to, Paige and I are more than happy to help in any way we can. So just shout at us, holler at us if you're looking for some content, some data that you might not have. But hopefully today, not hopefully, we're going to, hopefully we do it well, I should say. We want to talk a little bit about sharing assessment findings as you start to dig into some data. So again, we've talked about what assessment is. Paige and Brian talked about where to get some data, and now we're sort of getting at what do you do with it once you found something, once you've learned something. I think everybody here should know us, but obviously Mike Dial, I serve as the Assistant Director of First Year Advising, and I'll let Paige let you know who she is and what she does, but I think everybody knows her.
Yeah, I think I know everyone on this call, but my name's Paige McEwen, and I am the Coordinator of First Year Advising and Academic Intervention. So, yeah, thanks everyone for coming on this morning.
We record these things for perpetuity, so in the event that some future advisors watch this and in the year 2032, you'll know who we are. Well, cool. I guess let's start with a brief refresher. You know, in your own words or quoting what we shared last time, what is assessment? What's it mean to you? I see Skylar typing. Feel free to just turn on mics and chat. We're okay with that.
Yeah, you can pop on or pop in the chat. There's not that many of us, so.
Hello. I would say, like, very generally, assessment is just like seeing how things are going, seeing what's working, what's not working, and providing, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, providing evidence for why it's working or not working.
Yeah, I think that's a great definition. The definition we shared when we were all together last time, Skylar, I think that's right on the money. Comes from Upcraft and Shoe's work, assessment practice in student affairs and applications manual, and they define assessment as any effort to gather, analyze, and interpret evidence which describes institutional, divisional, or agency effectiveness. In our terms, that could be sort of advising at the University of South Carolina, that could be advising in the biology department of the College of Nursing, or it could be Kelsey's effectiveness as an advisor. So, you know, we could think of this in sort of multiple levels, obviously. But one thing that I don't think this definition does really well, it's all about describing institutional effectiveness. And what we're going to get to today is hopefully by using assessment, we don't just describe institutional effectiveness and efficacy, but we have an opportunity to potentially change practice. Or if we find that we're not as effective as we hope to be, or we could be better, or we find that students in population A outperform students in population B for whatever reason, we figure out what it is about those students in population A, whether it's something they bring to the table, whether it's a service, a treatment that they're getting that another group is not getting, and we're trying to figure out how to scale that out. So that being said, I'll turn it over to Paige, I believe, just to give you a brief overview. Oh, in a moment, we'll turn it over to Paige.
Sorry, I had a barking dog and still do. So, you know, work from home joys. So one other thing that kind of is a key component of the definition of assessment as we use it to make assessment a practical tool rather than just this theoretical idea that we talk about is the cyclical nature of assessment. And for those people who are visual out there, this is also super helpful because it presents, you know, a specific visual of what we're doing in the assessment process and kind of what we're hoping to achieve. So we talked a little bit about this in our first session, that we start with start and end with identifying our outcomes. What do we want to assess? What do we want to get at? Documenting what we already know, that can be gathering a data set, collecting a data set in some way, if we think we need a new data set of some sort to measure what we know, identifying those measures, gathering that evidence. So whether that is running a survey, running a focus group, getting your raw data out of a particular platform, interpreting evidence and disseminating results. So that's really where we're going to land and focus some today. And then obviously using those results ideally to implement change. So going back to Skylar's definition, which I think was really great, and simplified this, what's working, what's not. So what do we want to change with what's not working? So again, interpreting evidence, disseminating results, this sort of back half of the cycle is what we're really going to hopefully be boiling down for you guys and talking a little bit more about as we get through today, specifically that middle piece of what does your evidence look like and how can you present it in a way that is effective to your audience. We're going to talk about your audience a lot today.
So I guess then we get to thinking about why share assessment findings. So what is it we're trying to accomplish? One, it's an opportunity to tell an important story with meaning. I think Skylar talked about that in her definition of sort of what works and why is it working. If Skylar finds something that's working, we want to see if it's a transferable practice, a scalable practice for Christina, Rachel, Mackenzie, Katie, Kelsey, and the rest of the advising community. So you've got an important story to tell, and you're the one that has some meaning for it. By the time you've done assessment, by the time you've dug into some data and some numbers and crunched some numbers together, no one knows more about what you're sharing than you do. So you're sort of an expert at the table. You've positioned yourself to share something really relevant that potentially only you at this particular time can share. It's an opportunity to educate stakeholders and decision makers. Others may be other folks, collaborators in the work. It could be parents, students, just other folks engaged in what we do on campus. Decision makers really gives you an opportunity to impact and implement change at the University of South Carolina. That's education on context, background, the methods, both what you did, as well as the methods for how you sort of collected data and analyzed. And then finally, your results. So what is it you can share out? And then finally, we share assessment findings to identify possible next steps. So you'll see an example later of something that Paige and I are working on where we're sort of looking at what impact having beyond the classroom experience conversations with students has on their satisfaction with advising. And we know it has a statistically significant difference. It makes a difference in students' perception of their satisfaction with advising when advisors mention beyond the classroom activities. So if we through, we've got to start to think about what the next steps are. How do we ensure that more advisors engage in those conversations with students? So again, you'll see that example later. So as we get started today, I think this is sort of similar to a question we asked last time when we asked sort of why are you interested in assessment? We're curious today, what story are you hoping to share? What is it that you want to be able to assess? What is it that you want to be able to put out there into the world to make a difference here at the University of South Carolina or for your students or within your college, within your department? Sort of shout things out at us, get them in the chat. What change are you interested in making through story?
I guess this is Christine in the College of Nursing. I guess the biggest thing for me is my expectation was to just understand a little bit more about assessment and then, of course, figure out ways to use assessment to help us improve what we're already doing in the advising department, particularly with our students looking at upper division. We've already started looking at student outcomes and starting from that perspective. And so I think just building off of that and having a more efficient, reliable program.
Very cool. Yeah, I think finding out what's working and how you can share that out. Again, it comes to scalability. So if you find something's working for your students, how do you make sure all of your students have access to that treatment? Which sounds like a very cold process, but Katie says, trying to assess the new flipped advising approach. I want to learn more about the effectiveness of using it in advising. I think, Katie, right on the money. That's going to be an opportunity for you and the team around you to really sort of dig into the data, figure out what impact your flipped model had on the students that you serve. And then, from there, again, we get the scalability, figuring out what you did and how you can share those results with other folks. As you both have those sort of conversations, and others of you that are thinking about stories you might tell as you dive into your numbers. And know that the numbers themselves, the data, can be cold, they're very factual, they're objective, and in some studies, folks remember about 5% of individual statistics that are shared with them. So what they remember, though, are stories and things you made them feel. So stories tend to be warm, they're emotion-based, you talk about an impact you're having on students, they're subjective, and folks tend to remember them at a much higher rate. About 63% of folks in studies remember stories they've heard or remember sort of the key nuggets of a story as opposed to the data. So again, when we think about Katie's example with flipped advising, it's not going to be that, X% of students knew the Carolina core objectives before they came to advising, but it's going to be students were already prepared with some of the basic context of the biology degree. So by the time they came to us, we were able to have deeper, richer conversations that maybe even resulted in stronger relationships, more companioning with students, which then likely results in retention or student sense of belonging at the university. Again, I'm sort of making a lot of things up before Katie and the team around her have finished this process, but those are the kinds of things we'd want to see shared out. It's really the why. So stories, though, as we dive a little bit deeper, stories engage our senses. When we hear stories, our whole brain responds in a way that it doesn't respond just to data. The brain works to make sense of information more completely as it hears a story. Stories tend to bring us closer together. When you hear a story, your brain naturally activates and you become eager to physically process the emotions associated with the oral description you're hearing. They move us to feel. What we're really trying to do is give our audience a vicarious thrill that sort of puts them at the center of the story. Again, in Katie's example, because I think it's a good one, if we can say that as an advisor, Katie and the other bio advisors were able to build better companioning relationships with their students, I, as an advisor, want to be able to do that with my students. I put myself at the center of her story. I become the hero of her story and my vision of being able to use that method myself. Finally, stories move us to act in a way that data just doesn't. Stories can capture our attention and cause us to emotionally react and really feel a need to act, so feel a need to do something with the new information that we have. Communicate an effective assessment data effectively isn't just about creating shiny charts and having the best colors and the best pops of information on your screen and showcasing how smart you are because you dug into some data. It's about knowing the right amount of information to share, in what way, and to whom you should share it. And Paige will process that with us. Paige will talk about that with us as we move into this next phase.
Yeah. So once we've sort of identified what it is, the story that we're trying to tell, and we've moved through those other stages of the assessment cycle, we want to actually get into okay, what comes next? What's our step-by-step process for actually sharing these results and getting them to the people who need to see them? So kind of 5 steps here, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into a handful of them because some of them are pretty self-explanatory too. Step 1 would be to determine your audience. So we will definitely talk about in the next couple slides, what does that mean? Who's your audience? Why do we need to kind of consider them and think about them in what we're preparing to disseminate? Choose your communication format. So we'll talk about a variety of formats. It could be anything from a large booklet or annual report, glossy pages, all that kind of stuff, to just a one-pager that covers, your information at a glance and is really digestible. That's going to depend on your audience. Figure out what you're saying. So you have your data, you have, either your raw data that needs to be presented in some way that is accessible and digestible, or you have your stories, and you want to pick out those narrative pieces that are going to communicate what it is you're trying to get across to your audience. Then you're going to create your communication. This is where, a little bit of creativity comes in. We're going to talk a little bit about some very basics of data visualization. Data visualization can be a whole presentation in and of itself. I mean, a whole semester-long course in and of itself. But we'll talk about kind of the very basics and what that looks like in terms of how you create the visuals of what you're trying to communicate. And then finally, deliver and disseminate your communication. And we'll talk about kind of some things to consider there as well, because while that is pretty straightforward, you're delivering it to your audience. There's also, just some kind of follow-up things or things to think about when you are disseminating that information out. So let's talk a little bit more about audience. So in determining your audience, as Mike was kind of talking about early on, these are just some examples of people who might be audiences for the type of work that you guys are doing in assessment. So decision makers at the university level, whether that is, assistant and associate deans in your college, maybe it is going all the way up to the dean, whether that is, you're collaborating with another department on campus and there's sort of a roundtable situation coming together and those people are going to make decisions based on the data you produce. You could be presenting to faculty. So you could be taking some aspect of your advising that impacts students in faculty members' courses, and they want to know more about that information. You could be just presenting to other advising colleagues. So you would be, maybe presenting something a little bit more specific about, a particular advising approach that you're trying. I'm thinking back to Katie's point of most likely some of the first people that y'all may present to, Katie, are going to be other advisors on, hey, this is what we did and this is what we piloted. Look at how effective it was and what we were able to accomplish. There may be times when you're preparing data to present to students, and even parents at some points too. Parents might come up in other areas of, kind of higher ed and student affairs, but I can think of specifically at the college level when you're doing admitted students days or prospective students days, you may have particular data that you want to share with students and parents in concert in terms of, making sure that they are making the right choice of college. You might be sharing information about the majors in your college and student success. Again, I'm thinking back to what Christina was kind of saying. They're in the early stages, but they're trying to look at efficacy of these programs and success in these programs in the College of Nursing. So just some examples of who your audience might be. So as you're thinking through what am I assessing and what story am I trying to tell, thinking about who is going to be hearing that story. Then once you know who your audience is, you want to think about really targeting them and knowing what is going to be most beneficial for you to share with them, what's going to benefit you most in this assessment work that you've done, and what's going to benefit them and what they're going to listen to and to hear and digest. So what content or information is most relevant to them? What information do they need to make a decision if they are in some sort of decision-making position, which ultimately, if you're presenting assessment findings to a particular audience, even if it's not, sweeping policy change or anything, they are going to be making some sort of decision. Students and parents are making some sort of decision when you present information to them. And then what communication format might be most effective, which we'll get into in a second. But what information is most relevant to, a faculty member versus your colleagues in your student services unit? You might have one set of assessment information that you produced assessing a particular treatment, to go back to using Mike's words, the more kind of clinical word. And you might have one big set of information, but there might be a different way that you want to present it based on your audience. So you might be taking one data set and presenting it in multiple ways. That kind of goes hand in hand with what information does that particular group need from your assessment in order to make their decision. Again, could be vastly different between a faculty member who teaches XYZ course that all your students take versus an assistant or associate dean in your college who's trying to determine kind of a broader picture. So really thinking about kind of scope, broad versus narrow. Maybe it's a really specific piece of information, and that is all going to be based on your audience. So really thinking about your audience and what you need to highlight for them, and what's going to be digestible for them. So that's sort of where your distribution method comes into play. And like I said, these could be a whole variety of formats. These are just some examples. A written report could be anywhere from, 2 to 3 pages to a 15, 20, 25 page report. that's going to be something that is probably shared at higher levels, not something that you would create if you were kind of distributing casually. A one-sheeter, this could go a variety of different ways. Like a one-sheeter could go to, you know, a colleague or a group of colleagues at first, but it's something that gets shared out broadly. Again, when I was kind of talking about how to distribute and thinking about distribution and dissemination, thinking about where the information goes after your intended audience is also something important to consider. Presentation, I think that's probably a format for sharing information that we're all pretty familiar with and comfortable with. I think especially when we have an audience of students or parents, students and or parents, that is probably one of our most common formats, along with newsletters. I think when I think of newsletters, I really do think specifically of students. If we're creating, you know, information based on an assessment that we want to share out with students and have them know about our programs or our departments or our colleges, hopefully that's kind of a visually digestible thing for the student populations. It could go on a website. It could be its own website. You could be creating a website specifically dedicated to the assessment that you are doing. I think about this on the bigger levels of, say at some point your assessment becomes like a bigger research project or even like doctoral research. That may be dedicated to its own website. It also may be a piece of something that's on your college website, maybe its own webpage on your college website. I think a good number of our colleges and unit websites have pages on their sites dedicated to kind of assessment and findings, you know, high impact practices, things like that. It could just be one infographic that gets either put in one of these documents. So you could have an infographic in a written report, or an infographic on a website, an infographic in a presentation. And infographics, we can talk a little bit more about when we get to data visualization, but tend to be those like very visually appealing, usually look like they were made by some sort of graphic designer. Often that's probably just a website program that took the data that you had and made it look really pretty. They might be animated or interactive. So those are a whole nother kind of category of presenting data, but more accessible to, I guess, the lay person than you might think even. And then finally, it could be just things that are going in an annual report. So it could be assessment on your unit or your college that you have to produce for your blueprint report. And that doesn't make it any less important of assessment to share just because it's going to, you know, only the people who are going to see the blueprint, because you might be able to take those assessment findings, like I said before, in thinking about your audience, take those assessment findings that are in your blueprint, reconsider how you can maybe present them to another audience, and get your assessment shared out that much more broadly, get your results that much more out there kind of in the public. So in thinking about, you know, what does your audience care about a little bit more in depth? So we've identified our audience, we've maybe identified a format that's going to be really accessible to them. What are we going to present to them based on what we have, the raw data or even the narratives, the stories that we have? They care about something that they can change. So if we think back to the assessment cycle, you know, the last step that we really look at and consider is identifying, implementing change, and then using that change to identify new outcomes. That's how the cycle starts over. So our audience cares about something that they can change, something that they can potentially make a decision on. If it's not a decision-making type proposition in your assessment at that moment, your audience will care about the interesting or unusual findings. So, you know, say that you have found through your assessment that a specific population that might not have seemed obvious that you have identified through your assessment responds a certain way in a certain course or at a certain point in their progression of a major, or to a certain advising strategy, or even to a certain advisor, or type of advising approach. So interesting or unusual findings are going to be things that are worth presenting, because even if you don't necessarily think that there is change to be made from something at first, an interesting or unusual finding presented to the audience who cares about that might spark someone to think about change or a new intervention or a new technique in a way that you may be collaborating on, something like that. Kind of hand in hand with interesting and unusual findings, meaningful differences. So this is really when you have two kind of experimental groups, for lack of a better word. You're not running a true experiment because you didn't randomly select them, but students in population A outperform students in population B in X, Y, and Z component. And we were able to identify specific populations of those students. Oh, sorry. I thought someone was just knocking on my door. It really shocked me. So meaningful differences between those different populations would be something to present. And then finally, information that's relevant to them. So related to things that they care about, related to things that could impact their work, actual students that they're working with, or their unit, their classes, their divisions in the case of staff or faculty. We really think about relevant to them too in like the bigger university picture. So when we think about, and an example that Mike's going to show you guys in a little bit, assessing things related to having classrooms about co-curricular experiences and beyond the classroom learning, that's relevant in a bigger picture to everyone because it relates to the QEP. So the quality enhancement plan for the university, that's something that impacts all of us in a pretty big way. So thinking about assessment findings that are related to things that are impactful to people is going to get your audience hooked in and invested. So all of these things are worth considering as you plan sharing your data. So on the flip side of that, what won't get read, or if it gets read, won't be remembered? Thankfully, this is a much shorter list. The list of things that you can share with people that they will be interested in, as long as you've identified your audience correctly, is longer and more exciting than the list of things that to avoid, which is always good. So information that's not relevant to them. If you're presenting, really in-depth things about a certain curriculum that half of your students that you're presenting to are not a part of, that's not going to spark their interest in any way because it has no relevance to their experience or to things that they might be involved with. Reports that are too detailed or too long. This is sort of a catch-22 because you do want to be detailed enough that people can understand what you were doing and understand the points that you're trying to make. And you may have situations where you have to go into great detail and submit, a report of a certain length. And in that case, you obviously want to make sure that you're being detailed enough. But one thing that, I always like to go back to, and this is something that I've, grappled with in my own writing sometimes, is there's no particularly good reason to use 10 words when 5 will do. So if you can get your point across in fewer words or simpler words, then you should do that 9 times out of 10. So, that just keeps human attention span is notoriously short. We like to think that we're better than goldfish, but not by much. So you want to be able to keep people's attention. And then finally, reports or presentations that are really jargony. So, if you're presenting to students and parents, you're not going to want to use terminology that they are not yet familiar with unless you potentially take the time to say, okay, here's a little bit of a rundown because this technology or this terminology is going to be relevant to you. So if you know that something might be jargony, but you can't navigate a way around using it, educate on that terminology first rather than just jumping in. It's always good to write and present, audience appropriately, of course, thinking that someone in your audience is not going to be clear on the terminology you're using or the concept you're talking about. Give a little bit of background information, perhaps, a layer more than you think might be necessary, because that could draw in, another portion of your audience that you weren't even considering initially.
So as you go to create the story, this is somewhat of a summation of what Paige has said, but your goal is going to provide all the useful information to the right audience. So making sure that you're giving people what they need when they need it. A key is to not assume that your reports, presentations, etc., will only be seen by the audience you give it to. Katie, as soon as you send me your, whatever you put together on flipped advising, I'm going to kick it to Claire. We're going to probably take it to the advising directorate. I'm just thinking about how these things tend to roll out. So you've got to be careful when you do that. If you're suggesting that something should be a way that's contrary to what a decision maker might want or might be invested in, it's likely at some point going to get to that decision maker. So it's worth keeping in mind as you create these materials and your name's on them and they're floating around out there. As soon as you send it to one person, it very well likely will be sent around and shared with other decision makers. And you may end up sort of presenting your results in multiple ways over time. We keep hammering this Beyond the Classroom Learning Significance report that we've worked on. It was recently in a presentation that Claire and I did in a training. It's in a publication that a couple of us are working on. We've got this report, small report you'll see today. So just know that as you learn things, as you find things, it may get shared in multiple ways over time. Something you can do that's super effective, and we'll get into some effective methods here now, is to combine numbers and stories. So in what ways can you sort of hit people with a quick, easy to read, easy to see chart, but then follow it up with a narrative that explains or really hits people in the feelings. This is information from the academic recovery section that I teach in the Springs. To the recovery section compared to those that don't. These are first year students who start the spring semester on probation. 81% of students in the course I teach end up off of probation, compared to 46% of students who start on probation that do not take the course. So we've got some quick hits there. The course seems to be effective getting students off of probation. When you look, this is an actual student story who's sharing what the course did for him. He developed a schedule, he fixed sleeping habits, he was able to keep track of work, completed assignments he hadn't completed before, he changed his major, he's taking 2 classes. The key toward the end is that he really is going to be able to graduate on time. He thanked the peer leader and me for supporting him in the class. Quotes should represent a general range and sort of distribution of responses. You don't always need to use numbers. Think about when it works to say, most students, as compared to 60% or 55%. You can summarize results in tallies, percentages, aggregates, averages, some kind of qualitative summary. Just know that when you can hit people in both sort of an easy to read number they can see, or most, a quick hit there, and combine it with that quality narrative that a student can provide, or that you can share a story, that's when you can make sense of and be thinking about examples in your settings where you could compare both quantitative and qualitative data to tell the story you're trying to tell. Why do we think about using data visualizations? Paige is going to get into this here shortly and sort of what visualizations are and how to do them well. But we're visual creatures by nature, and we absorb information in a graphic format that would elude us in words. That's especially true when we get wordy and academic and scholarly in the words we put together. A quick vision, a quick visual will get across to people much faster. Images are effective when telling a story, especially when the story is complicated. So again, we'll come back to Katie's example. When she starts sharing about her work in flipped advising, Katie knows flipped advising forward and backward because she's gone through a class on it, she's reading up on it, she's built it. She and the other advisors in bio really built it and designed it for their space. But the folks she shares it with are not going to know what flipped advising is necessarily when they see her first piece. So being able to sort of graphically illustrate both what it is they're doing and the benefit it had on students will be important to get the message across. Visualizations reveal patterns, trends, and connections in data that could be difficult or impossible to see otherwise. I think about when we're collecting data, you run those reports that Paige and Brian showed you how to do in the last session. What you end up with is just a big Excel table full of letters and numbers, right? Visualizations are where we can take those letters and numbers and make meaning of them for our audience, and sometimes for ourselves. Sometimes just putting it in a chart is where you can start to see the differences on the page. And that's where plotting that data allows us to see the underlying structures.
So before I kind of move into this real quick with the kind of basics of data visualization, I did want to, because Mike brought it up on a previous slide, I wanted to kind of align terminology with some of the vocab that we almost presented in our last session with sort of what we're talking about here. Mike mentioned, thinking about qualitative and quantitative information, and qualitative is really going to be our data and our numbers, and quantitative is really going to be our data and our numbers. Qualitative is going to be your story. So where you can combine the two in terms of like research terminology is really when you get into something called mixed methods. So I only posit that not to throw more words at you, but if and when you continue kind of to dig into some of this information or further your own study of assessment on your own, that might be a form of study that you run across. And it simply just means in some way or another layering qualitative and quantitative information. And that's really what we're talking about here when we're saying combine numbers and narrative together to really produce a powerful result. And even when we have numbers, we often most likely want to avoid just showing raw data. And this is where data visualization comes into play. So data visualization is a fancy way of saying, what charts and graphs are you using? How are people seeing this in a way that catches their eye, is understandable, is easily digestible? And some of these things you guys are going to know already and don't realize that you know because you took a high school math class. And so you will know what some of these things look like and kind of what goes where. But just to give a quick rundown of it in the kind of context that we're talking about now, choosing your chart appropriately. So choosing the right chart for what you're trying to say. I have a really cool flow chart on the next slide that I found and I'm really excited about. I'm going to save it for lots of future use. And to do so, to choose your chart wisely, you're thinking about what you want to say, but keep in mind always that form follows function. So how is your audience going to be using the information that you're presenting to them? Answer that question first, and your answers for kind of how you want to share this will rise to the top. How are they going to use it is going to determine how they need to see it. Emphasizing the most important information, this is what Mike was kind of saying earlier with, you want to, it's not always about the prettiest graph or the prettiest color, but if you are going to be using graphs and charts, you do want to make it visually appealing. We are visual creatures, like Mike said on the last slide. That's why we use data visualization. Vision, seeing images that are stimulating allows us to process them better. So emphasizing, you can use this to your advantage to emphasize the most important information that you want your audience to see, even if that is just a different color scheme. Thinking about tables versus graphs. So this is sort of what I opened with. I kind of buried the lead here. Most of the time, you're going to shy away from a table unless you're really, really getting in the weeds with an in-depth report, because a table is an Excel spreadsheet. Is what you're going to use when you want to show many precise values. You want your audience to be able to have that information at their disposal. And again, it's going to be probably fewer situations that you would really include a table. A graph, though, is going to take that information in a table and present relationships, show patterns, show change, whether that's change over time, change in population, change over even distance. Probably not for our purposes, but could be. So graphs are going to be the visual representation of that. Give context. So make sure that you're not just throwing a graph in a presentation without any of that that story to go along with it, or a context of this is what we were looking at and this is what we found. Then kind of getting into the weeds of technicalities, but still very important things. Align and scale accurately and appropriately. So I tried to find a good visual example of this, but I couldn't find one. If you can play with the scale of your graphs and charts, so that a relationship or a trend looks more dramatic than it is. While in theory that may, make your results of your assessment look a little bit more profound, it's going to most benefit your audience if you are as accurate as you could possibly be. And then aligning your graph, just aligning your axes accordingly, so that visually it makes sense when your reader or your viewer is looking at it. Choosing the right colors seems silly, but again, because we are so visual, it's important, and it's going to appeal to people in certain ways. Paying attention to your titles. This goes along with providing context. Every graph needs a title. That's one of those elementary, maybe not elementary, but one of those middle school, high school math things. Every graph needs a title. And that's going to, again, assist you in providing context with what your audience is looking at. And clearly label. So clearly labeling your axes. If there are certain specific numbers that you want to point out in your graph, in your chart, labeling those numbers very clearly and clearly stating what they relate to. I think about that especially with something like a pie chart, when you want to show specific numbers in your percentage portions. But then also labeling, if you have some sort of XY, labeling what your axes represent so that your reader can get the most out of seeing the visualization that you worked on. So this next slide is this flow chart that I found, and I am happy to send this out to people because it got a little blurry when I put it in the slide. But I think the center box, we won't get into every single one of these charts today, obviously. The center box, though, I think is really valuable in terms of a starting place. What are you wanting to show? So 4 sort of main things. Are you wanting to show relationship? Are you wanting to show comparison? Are you wanting to show distribution? Or are you wanting to just show composition? So to start with composition, and that one did kind of get cut off at the bottom too. Composition is just going to be a visual way of showing the makeup of something. So then composition breaks down to, is it static? So are you just showing a particular moment in time, or are you showing change over time in your composition? And then from there, it breaks down into how many time periods do you have? And you can do things like different column and bar charts. And then it breaks down even from there of relative difference matter, relative and absolute difference matter. And then static is probably some of the things that we're most familiar with. If you are just showing a share of the total and how percentages break down, that's your pie chart. Accumulation or subtraction of a total would be like where you would show a total changing throughout whatever variable you're trying to demonstrate. And then components of components, you can break it down even further. So composition would just be your very basic makeup of a population. Relationship, these are where you have multiple intersecting variables. In a perfect world, you are trying to show that X impacts Y, or at least that there is correlation, because we know that correlation does not equal causation. And if you have 2 or 3 or more variables, you could do things like scatter charts and bubble charts. Comparison is probably the vast majority of what we would use, or you would use in depth when talking about assessments that you might run. So you can be comparing among items, or you can be comparing over time. These are where you're going to see things like column charts or matrices, bar charts where you're comparing many different items, bar or column. So a lot of people think the bar graph is just any graph that is, has colored bars. The vertical is actually a column chart, and then horizontal, showing your values changing over the x-axis, is actually a bar chart. So just some different things to think about there. And then comparison over time. A lot of these I know look pretty familiar for people. Things like a line graph would be, comparison over a long period of time, but not cyclical. I'd actually never seen that circular area chart before. I think that one's really interesting. You could also use column charts or multiple lines on a line chart for that as well. And then finally, distribution. This is going to show, where you have something that is fit to a line. So whether that's fit to exponential growth, or just steady growth, or a bell graph like a histogram. And that's going to depend on how much data you have, how many variables you have, things like that. So this is I loved this flowchart. I was like, I hit the jackpot when I found this one, because I think it gives us a good idea with, again, even if you just look at those 4 things in the middle, we know that we're using a column chart for comparison, a pie chart for composition, a histogram for distribution, and a scatter plot for relationship. Even if you just have those 4 and a line graph for overtime, even if you just have those 4 at your disposal, and kind of can really familiarize yourself with them, you can make data visualization out of most types of information that you would have. The book that Mike suggested is fantastic too. It's very visual. It's like a booklet. It's very visual, very good, like colors, and easily accessible. So just a little bit of a crash course in data visualization and what some of your options are, and how to think about how you want to present things.
So what we've got, we wanted to give you an example or two. So here I want to break down one of our one-sheeters. This is really easy to distribute. Something like this, I can share with Claire, and we can sort of process and make sense of the data and the language that's in here. We can also kick it up to Sandra Kelly, and she can see right off the bat from our quick findings section here that we've done some research, and we can report greater overall satisfaction with advising when advisors discuss beyond the classroom and experiential learning opportunities with their students. From there, we can give some context. We talked about that a little bit in the beginning, sort of what do you need to share, your background, your context, your methods, and your results. This is our background context area. So it really ties into some national literature. We're tying into what's happening out there in the greater higher education community and saying we can find these things to be true at the University of South Carolina as well. We also, if you look at that second paragraph, really hammer home the idea that academic advisors play a key role in getting students thinking about and intentionally planning their engagement in high impact practices, both in and beyond the formal curriculum. And then again, we're tying into some literature that's been out there. Lowenstein published in the Nakata Journal a few years back, 2005, that the excellent advisor does the same for students' entire curriculum or entire academic experience as an excellent teacher does for one course. So we're really laying the foundation here of how important academic advising is in the student experience. From there, we get into our methods, what it is that we did. We do that survey of a stratified random sample every other year to gauge the advising experience here at Carolina. And one of the questions analyzes students or advisors sharing those beyond the classroom experiences. We get into a little bit of what the numbers are, how many students responded, how many students said their advisor did have those discussions, how many said they didn't. And then for folks who are interested in it, we get into the statistical analysis that was done. This is sort of the researchy, statistics heavy piece of this document, but it's a very small piece of the document, which I think is important. From there, we can share, and you can see very visually that when we plot student satisfaction with advising against advisors recommending beyond the classroom activities, students are significantly more satisfied with advising when their advisors have these conversations with them than when they aren't. So this kind of a one-sheeter tells a complex story in a pretty simple way. You can get what you need out of it. If you're sharing something like this with faculty who want to know if what you're talking about has some real meaning, is there a statistical analysis behind it? And Paige and I can certainly help with that. If you have data sets, if you want to look at statistical analysis, sharing both sort of the quick hit up top, the chart at the bottom, and the statistical analysis in the middle makes this a really intuitive one sheet for anybody that needs to make meaning of it, right? Just another quick example for you. This is something I sent Dan Friedman at the end of this spring on the recovery course outcomes. I was really nervous with us flipping to virtual in the middle of the semester and me working with a group of students who are already at going to look great this year. wanted to hammer home right off the bat that this course works. I think University 101 at USC works, and I think this recovery course is important and makes a real difference for students. So a little bit of definition about what the course is, who participates, 19 students every term, 16 began the term on probation, and then there's your quick hit. On average, students achieve greater increases in the institutional GPA than their peers who did not enroll in the section. You've already seen this chart over here. The one at the bottom looks at first year students on probation at the end of their term. And we're missing a chart here, so a label here, something fell off. But students who enrolled in the course, it's end of term should be, the garnet should be fall 2020. So students who engaged in this course at the end of fall 19, going into spring 20, obviously outperformed their peers who did not enroll in the recovery course. And then just some basic information about the course here. As we continue to think about assessment, and Paige and I are sort of on this drive to get advisors engaged in the scholarly conversation out there, there are a lot of places that you can publish your assessment results. A number of these journals are really tied to more academic research that should have broad-reaching implications beyond the University of South Carolina. But these three that are highlighted here, and there are a few others out there, are great places for practitioners, and that's what we are. We're practitioners. For practitioners to share what they're finding. Academic advising today is a pretty simple process to get published in if you've got something to say. Paige and I were in their last December issue. We're going to be in the upcoming December issue. We're happy to talk folks through that process. eSource for College Transitions is another practitioner publication that comes from, is produced by the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience here on campus. I used to serve on their editorial board, so I'm more than happy to work with anyone who's interested in sort of putting a message out there through that venue. And then the Mentor and Academic Advising Journal is another sort of smaller publication where practitioners can pretty easily get some content out there. The toolbox is really about, it's another one that's similar to that, but it's really about teaching. So it would be a little tougher for advisors. But NACADA Review is another really interesting one where you can really sort of apply the practical things you're doing in advising to some theory that's already out there and already floating in the community. You can make meaning of theory through this publication. But all that being said, we do encourage you as you get further into this and as we can help you to get your message out there. Finally, this is a slide I think most of you saw in our last session, but assessment can be either single loop learning or we can do a version of double loop learning. Single loop learning is where you, the advisor, find something, you make meaning of it, you change your practice, or you keep doing exactly what you're doing because it's working. That's great, and that's a wonderful step in assessment. But when we move to double loop learning, we're really thinking of assessment as organizational learning. So that's when people in the organization investigate our assumptions, essential aspects of advising, fundamental knowledge about what we do here at Carolina, and then find something and feed it back into the system, feed it back into others' processes. It requires distribution of decision-making power to allow for healthy dialogue about information gathered. Katie's example is another great example of that. Katie came to us and said, hey, I want to do flipped advising. She talked to Amanda Ziegler and some folks in the College of Arts and Science, talked to us in the UAC. We said, yeah, go for it, figure it out, make it work. And Katie and I had some conversations earlier about, you're going to have to assess this so that if it works, we can scale it up. And then it creates commitment. It communicates trust, it validates competence, and develops viable decision-making networks. That's what we need. We need advising at all levels, from the advisor to like Paige and I and Jane, up to Claire, straight up to Sandra Kelly and university leadership, all being engaged in making decisions about how we navigate advising at the University of South Carolina. And it has to be evidence-based, and that's where we're going with this series of sessions. That being said, we wrapped about 5 minutes later than I thought we would, but we've got a little bit of time for questions. Anything we can chat through, and I know Jane has a survey for you all as well.
Hey guys, I have a question. This is Mackenzie. Um, hey, so, you know, um, I guess the basic question here is who who owns the data that we collect? Question related to, so let's say I do some research and I say, people who eat at the cafe in the Moore School are less likely to be successful in their accounting class, like something random. And then I want to publish that under my name, who, sorry, I got a 7-year-old doing class in the background. But who owns that, or who do I have to get permission from in order to, really dig into that? Because essentially, even though I wouldn't be releasing individual student grades, I would be looking into academic success or academic performance in individual classes. I just always have concerns about that.
Yeah, I think, and Paige may have thoughts here, but I think it depends on what you're wanting to do with it. So if you're talking about publishing something in a publication versus publishing something that gets floated around campus, those are probably two different things. eSource, academic advising today, the toolbox, the mentor, they don't require rigorous IRB approval, which if you're thinking about, pushing something to a journal, you would have to have IRB approval beforehand in most cases, if you're talking about student grades and you name it. If you're talking about sharing something on campus, generally speaking, we're safe to do that. I think you need to be careful if again, your example is students in Mike Dial's U101 section, business students in Mike Dial's U101 section perform worse than other sections. That would be something we would caution you against sharing if you're putting someone on blast through assessment, if that makes sense. There's probably better, I know that's a cheesy example, but there probably, we would need to generalize more. In terms of some of those publications, what I've always found, the smaller practitioner publications, is getting my leadership chain. If my leadership chain's okay before I put those things out, has always been my best practice. So if I'm publishing about some stuff I do in U101, I talk to Dylan Friedman and say, hey, this is an article I've drafted. Do you have any issues with me pushing it out there to the community? Does that answer your question at all? Well, at all?
Yeah, I think so.
The other thing I would say to Mackenzie is in regards to IRB is depends on how you're collecting. Like if you design some sort of like intake or survey to determine who's eating in the cafe, and you're identifying student information from that and wanting to make sure that students are aware that these are the ways that their information could be used. I think once you start to go down that kind of more experimental rabbit hole, regardless of how you're going to share it out or publish it, it can't hurt to seek out IRB approval. And for something that's that like low stakes, it would probably be a pretty straightforward process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Rachel. We are at 10 o'clock, so I want to make sure we respect folks' time, but thanks for tuning in today. And for those of you who stuck with us for 2 or 3 sessions, thanks for sticking with us through all of them. I hope it was a valuable experience.